Tommy Scoops and David Goss at SoccerWise. We are talking about Nashville SC under BJ Callahan trying to rewrite the script a little bit and turn themselves into maybe a different style of team in Major League Soccer. They are hoping, based off last year, a more successful team. We had a conversation with two of the best in Nashville at 615 Soccer in Valère and Ben. Valère working on Pharmaceutical Soccer's, Ben, one of the best writers covering Major League Soccer just across the board, the whole league, as well as Nashville specifically. Tom, someone you know very well. I sat down with them to chat about this team and about this club. But before we get into that one, a move was made after we had this conversation. We already knew that they had tapped in to their Scandinavian markets to bring in some attacking pieces, Tom. They've now increased that since we've last recorded.
Yeah, Nashville SC are finalizing a deal to sign Ahmad Kassem, a Swedish youth international attacker, a very versatile player. He can play on either wing. He could play as a 10 or a false 9 if needed. I don't think that they'll need that for this team, but that just shows his versatility. He can play on either flank, which is going to be very, very useful for BJ Callahan and this team as they try to find out the most optimal attacking combinations. And if you could plug and play this player, Kassem, around kind of the front line and see exactly what works, how he can complement these other players. And just for rotational purposes, it's a long season. You need to have players with versatility.
It also goes into the conversation around the 4-2-2-2 or the 4-3-3. It seems like the two pieces they've brought in are players who are comfortable centrally, but are natural attacking wide players. And so it gives them the flexibility to be able to move into and out of that formation as BJ Callahan still tries to figure out what this team is. And I think for Nashville fans, it should be exciting. Like that next progression, can you be a possession team? Can you change? Can you affect the way teams choose to play rather than being reactive? Can you be proactive and sort of set the tone in a lot of games? They haven't been a club that's done that, and they can be. This is a team, when you look even at Walker Zimmerman being signed as a DP center back, I think I went through it. They had 3 of the 15, 16 highest paid players in Major League Soccer. So it's like we talk about small market, but this is a club that has spent. And I think their expectation should be that they are a competitive playoff team year in and year out and probably pushing for a home game.
For sure. This team kind of hit their peak, like the cycle came to the end last year. Cost Gary Smith his job. There was a lot of familiarity within the group. They did phenomenally in their expansion year and the years beyond to be sustainable, to be really good, to be consistent. Again, they weren't the most exciting team to watch, but they don't really care if they were picking up results. That's why Gary Smith lost his job because, well, you were really boring to watch and you weren't winning. That's a combination that does not last very long. They're changing under BJ Callahan. It did not get all that much better under him results-wise. They were trying to be more expansive. They were figuring it out along the way. A full preseason for BJ Callahan is going to be good for this group and trying to, again, be more expansive, get Hani Mukhtar back to firing where he was, which is interesting because he was putting up a ton of numbers. He was one of the best players in the league, MVP, all of that, extremely consistently in a team that was always playing against the ball.
Right.
He was an absolute killer in transition, and then he just fell off a cliff. And Walker Zimmerman got injured. And when Hani Mukhtar was an MVP level player and Walker Zimmerman was a Defender of the Year caliber player, the margins became super thin and this team dropped. I don't think that they need to be MVP Defender of the Year to get back to that level. That's the idea with the coaching change and the style change. But they have to both be really, really good or this team will not be good.
BJ Callahan is a fascinating story just to go from Villanova Soccer where he was to into the USSF pool and slowly work your way up into being eventually an interim head coach of the U.S. men's national team, which immediately puts you on the list for interviews for MLS head coaching jobs. Like there are not that many names in this sphere. We do it on this show all the time. Who would you hire? What would you do? And like, it is not that easy to find someone perfectly qualified, especially because many coaches in MLS, there's not really a stratosphere. If you have a job that you like and you do well, you're not going to leave. And so BJ Callahan's a fascinating story. Valère and Ben sort of talk about it. They are excited about his personality and how open he's been and what he can sort of mean to the club. I would love to go to Nashville. I've only been one time. I went for a playoff game. Nashville won. They beat Orlando right during COVID, I believe. So you're welcome, Nashville fans. You should welcome me back with open arms. And I would love the opportunity to eat some hot chicken and hang out in Nashville. So I'm hoping for a good season for Nashville SC, and maybe we get to see another final there at Geodis Park. That was the peak at Geodis Park so far, was that League Cup final. that building should be bouncing. That should be one of the best atmospheres in Major League Soccer. And so the hope is this year, if they can consistently put together performances, they can get that done. So another big signing made, but let's now go to our conversation with Ben and Valer. Our preseason previews continue here at SoccerWise, and we've got a big one here. We've got a great group of guests, sans Tom Bogert, so an even better situation for us to put together one of the best shows of the year. We're talking Nashville SC, and we are doing so with Ben and Valer of 615 Soccer, a newly launched website covering all things soccer in Nashville, and the Pharmaceutical Soccer Show podcast that you can get, of course, anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you to both of you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, really excited.
Valer, you had me on your show a week ago, so you're like on the verge of being sick of me. I think that my wife tells me like I'm right on the edge of where people really get frustrated. But I had a ton of fun. It was a great show. I think you told me we would do 30 minutes and we did like an hour and 5. So yeah. I told you 30 minutes here. So we'll see what happens on the back end of this. Ben, you're part of the launch of the new website. Tell everyone a little bit about it if anyone hasn't been there yet.
Yeah, so I mean it's a new kind of soccer specific website that we started, trying to give high level coverage of soccer in Nashville. Myself and Valer and then Chris Ivey kind of headed it up, and we have a really, really cool team of people working with us. And I think it's been really exciting to see just how interested the Nashville community is in soccer and kind of the support that we've already gotten. I think it's far exceeded our expectations going into it. So yeah, it's been really exciting, and we're excited for the first kind of year doing this on our own.
And for anyone who wasn't listening to our show, I think it was a week ago, Chris Ivey put together the best list of what happened with the 2025 MLS roster rules. We plugged that on our show. We basically just read the article, and then we pretended to talk about it like we knew what was going on. So it's not just Nashville. If you like MLS, if you like soccer in this country, you should be following 615 Soccer. You should be listening to the Pharmaceutical Soccer Show as well. But we are here to talk Nashville. We haven't really done it a lot on SoccerWise. Since we launched last summer, there hasn't been a ton of conversation outside of the appointment of BJ Callahan. So let's go through the transfers a little bit as to get started, and then we will dig into some of the big storylines. We've got our Doyleism coming up a little bit later, and we've got our line set by Andrew Wiebe as well that we will get to. When you start with transfers, and it's not normally a category that's a big part of the conversation around Nashville, you have some big names coming in. Edward Taxeth being brought in, Andy Nahar, Jason Palacios, and then the big trade in the middle of the offseason in which MLS Cup MVP Gaston Brugman was brought into the fold in place of Sean Davis, who is one of many big names going out. One of the originals that this club has been built on, Annabelle Godoy, was let go, as was Drew Yearwood, Randall Leal, Brian Anungana. And then that Sean Davis trade was the start of a pretty big trade window in which one of the most expensive fullbacks in league history, Shaq Moore, was traded, as well as former starter Lucas McNaughton. So a lot to go on, a lot going in and out. Ben, get us started here and just the reactions to some of the big names, the staples this club was built on, being let go.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it kind of felt like an extension of last year when Dax McCarty was let go. I think he was probably the first big name original that kind of left the club. I think Godoy is probably right behind him just in terms of popularity and importance to the club for their first 5 years. But really, I think the overarching themes were, A, trying to get better with the ball, which Callahan obviously comes in and wants to do as a guy who came kind of from the Berhalter coaching tree. I think they're trying to get younger too. That might get muddied a little bit with some of the free agents they've signed who are kind of early 30s. But it's really just trying to get added improvements with the ball, get a little bit younger, and probably add some flexibility going into what is probably going to be, I think, a two winter window rebuild. I don't think they're done yet, and I think the team probably isn't going to be complete, if you can even call it that, until probably next year.
And they had to make a lot of harder decisions. Also, like I know you mentioned Randall Leal and Brian Anunga. Both of those are also originals.
Right.
You know, they were both there since 2020. So it was a continuation of that. And then the other thing I'll mention just really quick while we're talking about transfers, that Patrick Yazbak came in halfway through last year. And that's kind of part of this core more so than anything beforehand.
What is the emotional reaction, though, Valera, for a club that hasn't moved a lot of these pieces around to have 4 or 5 originals, and really the last connection to it outside of a Walker Zimmerman and a Joe Willis to finally move on and see this offseason.
So I'll say this, for people in Nashville, they know that the OG is Taylor Washington, who's been with the club since the first year of USL. So he's been this is his 8th year with the club after the 2 USL seasons and 5 MLS seasons. And now they're entering 6th MLS season, which is pretty crazy to say, but he is still contracted with the club. He's still playing with the club. And, you know, as far as fan favorites, he's like the top name that no one outside of Nashville will like think about, but he is like a pretty big figure within the Nashville SC and the Nashville soccer community as a whole. Great guy, by the way, as well. So it kind of adds to the whole thing. But I think you saw a little bit last year when when Dax McCarty ended up leaving the club. I think what added a little bit of salt to the wound is that he ended up signing for Atlanta, which is, you know, right down the road, a team that is quote unquote rival, however many rivals Nashville has these days. But I think what ends up happening here is that that justification just wasn't there, because what we heard from the Nashville SC side is that, you know, he's getting a little too old, and you know, the squad has kind of moved away from that, and they want something else. Well, last year, it seemed like they really needed Dax McCarty. They seemed like they really needed somebody in midfield who can play a diagonal pass that will get somebody, you know, one-on-one with a defender. And anybody who watched Nashville SC was like, we really need a midfielder that can do that. And, you know, Dax McCarty was
beating Messi in the playoffs.
I was going to say, he had an incredible last year.
Stuff.
A lot, yeah. So I think that started with him, and then going into now, you're talking about Anibal Godoy and Enunga and Leal. I think people are starting to understand these moves a little bit more, just because the team was bad last year. Yeah. I think when you talk about when Dax McCarty left, the team was about to play their first ever CONCACAF Champions Cup. The team was on a you know, trajectory that was different from now. Finishing 13th, missing the playoffs, people are more accepting of change when that happens.
Ben, you mentioned BJ Callahan. He's not a new coach, but he got appointed late in the summer last year. It didn't feel like we learned a ton from the outside, at least, just because he had to put together the rosters and the lineups he had to put together based off what was available. Give people sort of an inside look, as you've been covering him, what he's like as a person, what he's like around the club.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, just personally, he is super outgoing, super friendly. I think he kind of gets the media side of the game, and so he's been just super open with the media, very always willing to talk, very willing to kind of help us out however he can. So that's been kind of nice to see. On the field, I mean, just even from talking to people before he was officially hired, everybody I talked to said he is like the hardest worker they've ever seen around the game and one of the most detail-oriented guys they've ever seen. And I think from talking to him, that completely adds up. He has a very, very clear style of how he wants to play. He goes into a ton of detail to make sure that everybody is on the same page. But I think he also tries to get everybody understanding his system to a very kind of granular level, so that they can kind of not even have to think about it. He's wanting to install it so it's almost second nature, so that they're not having to think about where to play a pass, because they have done it so many times that they know how to. Stylistically, I think he wants to be, I mean, everybody says they want to be a possession-based team and to be a pressing team, and I think there are some kind of coaching platitudes that go on there, but from watching him, they do play with the ball and they do press. I don't know exactly how married he's going to be to any particular shape, but I think kind of across all of those, they're going to play with the ball. They're going to try to break teams down with possession, but they're also going to press pretty hard without the ball. And I think you're going to see a lot of their chances come just from forcing turnovers close to goal.
He's still in the honeymoon phase, so it's still the dry January of the year as we get past the Super Bowl, and then all the workouts and the plans and the health food and all those ideas start to go out the window. So we're still probably a little bit away from that one. Update for everyone, as we like to do here with all of the 1,000 cup competitions people can play in. Nashville will only be in the U.S. Open Cup, not being a playoff team last year. Didn't qualify for Leagues Cup, not a part of CONCACAF Champions Cup, and obviously cannot play in Canada. But Valer, that actually gives an opening, an opportunity, which we talked about when I was on your show, of it's a one cup that you can focus on, and you're only a few wins away from like a really big game potentially in your own building.
Yeah, I think you look at 5 games total to win a cup, the first cup in franchise history too. I think BJ Callahan and everybody in the club will be circling that as something to look forward to. I think when you look at how Champions Cup affected Nashville last year, they ended up only playing 4 games, but traveling to the Dominican Republic, traveling back, and then playing Miami twice in March, that early in the season, it was already like a full blown like dramatic thing that was happening. Nashville goes up 2-0, come back, Miami 2-2 at home. All that stuff happens, and it didn't just affect the season from a physical standpoint, but it also affected it from a narrative standpoint because already you were out of a cup competition that was supposed to be like the most exciting thing, right? It's the first time you're in Champions Cup. You were already out before April. So you're looking at a very different situation, and then you're losing in the league, and that leads to Gary Smith's dismissal and all that. So I think the U.S. Open Cup is the opposite of that, where if you get a couple wins in the early rounds, you'll probably play in a USL team or the lower team on the very first round, and then you might play an MLS team with a possibility of hosting them. You get those 2 wins, you find yourself in the quarterfinals. You already have something to point at. And I think I was listening to you guys maybe a couple of weeks ago talking about SKC and making that cup final and what that did for their season, where it was like in any other situation, that season will be over. It's done. They had nothing to play for. But because they had that cup final to look forward to, it kind of kept it alive and kept the fans engaged a little bit more. And I think that's what this can serve for Nashville. So even if they make it to the semifinal and lose, let's say, or make it to the quarterfinals and lose. Quarterfinals is a little hard, but I think with the amount of MLS teams participating, it's a really, really good opportunity for Nashville SC to go out there and actually, attempt. I think they'll be one of the favorites going into it just based on the teams out there. You know what I mean? And I think they haven't ever entered any competition where they are the favorites.
It's a fun one for Nashville too, because you talked about rivals down the road, Atlanta, whether or not it is and isn't. There are some more localized teams from lower divisions that a Nashville can play where they're not going to get the opportunity other times. So you talk about a Chattanooga, you bring in, I see the Louisville scarf behind Ben in this one if you're watching via video. I don't think Ipswich is in the U.S. Open Cup this year, but they could try. So there's a lot of more localized clubs that you get the opportunity to play. Let's go to our Doyleism now, and then we'll sort of jump off the back of that.
I just feel like Nashville are in some trouble. They went out this offseason and they got Gaston Brugman to be their number 6 in, I think they wanted to play a 4-3-3. And he would sort of fill the gap left by Dax McCarty that they struggled with last year, just in terms of ball progression, getting the ball into good spots so that players like Hani Mukhtar could actually make stuff happen. And I understood the thought process behind that, but we've already seen in preseason they've gone away from the 4-3-3 and into that 4-2-2-2, which doesn't really fit Brugman, even though it fits Hani. And then the other thing is they didn't really upgrade either of the wide midfield or wing spots, if you want to call them wingers. They don't really have a third heat in attack. And so it's all coming back down to Hani and Sam Surridge again. And we just saw last year it's not working anymore. And the back line, like, okay, Walker Zimmerman's back, but he's also sort of staring at his mid-30s at this point. And we saw last year that he's not as durable as he was. Jack Maher has never become or has yet to become the kind of guy that we hoped. Fullbacks are a little bit in flux. Goalkeeper's a little bit old. I mean, there have been some pieces added, but this was a team handcuffed by the roster build at the end of last season, and it still feels like they're handcuffed heading into this season. So if there's gonna be progress, maybe Johnny Perez. Like he's a dynamic 1v1 player, and they've never really had that, but he's also never really looked like a full-time starter at the MLS level. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to find something to get too excited about with this Nashville team.
Doyle bringing us in on a high. You have to absolutely love it as he goes through every single layer of the team. So we'll dig back through what he said. Let's start here, Ben. You mentioned BJ Callahan, maybe not married to one system. Doyle touched early on the formation, the setup, how it all looks. What do you make so far of what you've seen, what you've heard, and how this would all fit together?
Yeah, so that was going to be the one kind of sticking point I had with what Doyle said. I don't think they ever built this roster with one specific shape in mind. Like I said, I think they want to be flexible. I think we're going to see them use a couple different looks. I also think that in this 4-2-2-2 or whatever they've been using during preseason, I definitely understand kind of the concern about Brugman getting maybe a bit overrun in midfield without the ball. I think the counter to that is that you have, on the wings, they have Alex Muyl and Edward Taxeth, who just cover almost inhuman amounts of ground. And so it's not like he's going to be left isolated when they're without the ball. But yeah, I think what Doyle said is probably the kind of the worst case scenario. I think there is a best case scenario that's significantly higher than that, and I imagine they're going to be somewhere kind of in between those two.
And I will add on the Brugman stuff. He's only contracted through 2025, and that trade came in with a Sean Davis going the other way. So if Brugman is just replacing the Davis minute, which he only played 30 minutes with BJ Callahan, I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but it was it was not a lot, trust me.
And he started 2 games under Callahan.
Yeah, so you're looking at somebody to come in at that level to where that position, what we've seen from preseason now, I don't know if that's the plan going forward, but Brian Acosta seems to be taking that role as the starter there. Again, we don't know. Brian Acosta, we've seen him in MLS before, not necessarily impressed in MLS, but my point is that, if you just think of Brugman as replacement to Sean Davis rather than some sort of a big improvement piece, then you are really upgrading there based on what Nashville needs.
And you talked about Yazbek before we went into our Doyleism, who you think will be a big part of that midfield as well.
Yeah, I think he's going to be taking over, a starting spot right next to Brian Acosta and or Brugman probably, in that sort of deeper two of the midfield. And then in front of him, like Ben said, it's Taxeth and Muyl most likely. And when you look at Taxeth and Yazbek, the differentiator between the two of them is that I know they both came from Scandinavian leagues, but Taxeth is more forward facing, but both of them covered pretty much the same amount of ground, which is crazy to think for somebody who's playing as a quote-unquote winger. Now, obviously, Taxeth is more of a central player anyway, so he's going to tuck in a little bit more. And I think what we saw is that a little bit of an interchangeable at times when needed. Yazbek can be the more forward-facing one, but at most, I think from what we've seen of him so far, is that he will be more deeper, and what he's capable of is not only fighting and getting the ball, which Nashville midfielders have been able to do for this whole time, is that once he gets the ball, he knows how to move it to the right piece. And that, as easy as it sounds, I know it sounds easy, but Sean Davis, Brian Anunga, and other midfielders really struggled with that piece last season and every season for Nashville SC. Anytime there wasn't a Dax McCarty, and even Anibal Godoy struggled with this sometimes, but pretty much Dax McCarty was the only midfielder who can move it from deep positions to a really dangerous position within one pass or maybe 2 passes at most.
We a lot to talk about with this Nashville team. I know, Ben, you've been saying BJ sort of has higher expectations for Brugman, maybe than Acosta. Brugman has struggled with injuries the last few years. That's part of the LA Galaxy getting off him. So it's good to have the depth in that position. And we know when healthy and at his peak, he can be very, very good, as we saw. Whether he's a part of this or not, because I think MLS Cup may be a little bit of an outlier, how dangerous he was offensively. Doyle talked about that third weapon, having Hani Mukhtar, having Sam Surge. Do you feel like that is as glaring an issue as he brought up?
Yes, if they don't address it over the course of the season. I think there are 2 maybe caveats to that. The first is Tyler Boyd, who tore his ACL last summer and is going to be back and healthy, and it's still a pretty big part of their plans. Obviously, he's, I think, 30, 31. Coming back from an ACL isn't a given, but assuming he can come back to 80% of his prior level, he should be a pretty important piece for them. I think optimistically he'll be kind of back in training in late March. I think that the timeline that they're hoping for is that he can actually start games and play 90 minutes sometime in June to July. So that's one piece. They also have they have U22 spots to work with and an international roster spot open, and they've been linked. I mean, Tom has linked them to Valeria, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation.
Ahmed Qasim.
From Scandinavia. I think they've been linked with 2 or 3 wingers from Scandinavia, and it feels like there is smoke. There is fire to that smoke. I don't think it's just hearsay. I think they're looking at someone pretty significantly. I don't know if they bring them in before the season starts, but I would be shocked if they go throughout the summer without adding a pretty big piece there. And if they can stay relevant for the first couple months of the season, I mean, anything can happen. But yeah, it's a big if.
Yeah, it is. It's a big position. Valera, I was on your show. I talked about Johnny Russell. It was right after he sort of said, I want to come back to MLS. And then we were texting about Ted DiPietro right after that move happened. Of that would have been one that could have made sense for Nashville to use your U22 initiative spots with players who you've already seen in this league succeed. I would expect Nashville would be in a bunch of those conversations, especially right as the season comes to a start and you start to get into some roster pinches. For some teams, like we're waiting on the Lucho Evander stuff as of recording this and a bunch of other news that could drop. But you do start to see as you get into roster freeze dates, teams that haven't organized things the way they'd like or not everything that's gone in the right direction. Nashville could be a comfortable landing spot of we can get quality at a cheaper price, or maybe we can even rent out those spots for players that we think could have the quality to perform for us. Let's finish off here with a conversation about one of the biggest names, but then I think the biggest aspect of this team, which is the strength, has been the backline. It's been the defense. Doyle somehow got Walker Zimmerman into his mid-30s, which I oppose vehemently. Like, don't add years to anyone. As someone who is approaching that and was celebrating a friend's birthday this weekend and was like, I'm close to dying. So I think we should all take advantage of every year we can still claim. Andrew Wiebe set our line for Walker Zimmerman. Starts in Major League Soccer, so this is MLS only, at 22.5. I know some of the thinking was on injuries, and I think some of the thinking there is probably on Gold Cup as well, with Walker being a part of Pochettino's winter window and being around the national team for whatever games they're going to be playing over the course of this year. Valera, what's your thoughts on that line, and where would you fall?
Yeah, I think the reason why the line is lower than what we expected is probably because Walker Zimmerman participated in the Olympics last year. And I think that's something that is missing from this point. And I don't see him taking part in every single USMNT camp. I do see a chance for him to be in the Gold Cup, but even that is really up in the air. If this was Berhalter still, I'd probably say 100% the Gold Cup. But with Pochettino, we still don't know. The only camp Pochettino has called him to is the January camp, which would be wild for Walker to not be called up to that, honestly. So I think it makes sense, and it's possible that he goes to Gold Cup. But even with that, in terms of his health, he did have a couple injury issues the last couple of years. But overall, I wouldn't put him in the injury-prone area, right? I think he's capable of putting in a lot of performances, and I think 22.5, I would smash the over on that, honestly, just from what I've seen, just from what I know. And I think for Walker specifically, he's going to come into this. He's the face of this franchise, and there's no way around it. I know Hani Mukhtar won MVP. Overall, people in Nashville know Walker Zimmerman, and not just soccer people, just people in Nashville. He's the captain of the club. He's the face of the franchise. Probably the only DP center back in MLS. I don't know. Teenage Hadebi is not anymore, right? But I don't know who else is left. But you know, they don't usually give that sort of money to center backs in MLS, and especially not American ones. So I think when you look at what Walker has provided for Nashville and what Nashville has provided for Walker, he's gonna be really motivated to come into this season with something to prove. And I think the 22.5. Barring a crazy injury, I think I really can see him going maybe closer to the 30 mark with Nashville.
Ben, before I let you go, let me give people some context. I probably could have done this. So Walker did start 22 games last year, but of 25 appearances. So it's not like we're in a situation where if he's healthy or available, he doesn't start. He has not started less than 22 games since he got to LAFC in 2018, but he's been right around that line most years. Now, one of those years includes a COVID year where he started all 22 games he played in and then peaked with 28 starts in 2022. So like Valera said, international, a big part of that. Injury prone probably isn't the term you'd use, but availability has not always been there. Where do you fall on this line, and where do you fall on the rest of the defense around it, and whether he is or isn't available every single game, how strong this can be?
Yeah, so funnily enough, like literal minutes before we started recording, I was talking to Doyle about this and told him I came to terms with my own mortality when he referred to Zimmerman as an old center back because he's like 3 months older than me. So getting up in age.
So
no,
Doyle
look,
would not be excited about you in a preseason prediction. Just warning you, just in case he gets stuck.
yeah. But look, so Zimmerman, he had Achilles surgery last winter off season, and like I talked to him before the season. He's like, "Hey, I'm finally like this is the first time in a year plus that I've actually felt healthy." Came back, looked great, and then he had kind of a freak knee-to-knee collision in a game against Miami early in the season, and that required another surgery. And that's, other than the Olympics, that's really what kept him out a lot last year. And so like Valera said, I don't think those are really repeatable concerns. And honestly, I think if he does get called up to the Gold Cup, it's because he would have had to be playing out of his mind for the first half of the season. And I think Nashville would take that happily. I think Zimmerman is probably the defender I'm least concerned about at all this year. I think he'll be around. He's also out of contract this year too, so kind of added pressure on him to perform and either stay in Nashville or earn himself a contract somewhere else. I think the rest of the defense is kind of up in the air. Right back, it looks like it's going to be Andy Nahar and Julian Gaines kind of competing for the starting spot / sharing starting minutes. I think Dan Levitz is probably the lockdown at left back, and you know what you're going to get from him, but he's also 33. And I don't think they really have a real challenger behind him. So I'm not so concerned about that. I think you kind of know what you're getting, and there's not a ton of upside down the left. I don't really know who is going to start next to Zimmerman consistently. Jack Mayer, I think we always think he has a high ceiling, but he certainly has not hit his ceiling to date. And I worry that he's never going to. And like, if he's kind of just a mid-level MLS starting center back for the rest of his career, that's fine. But I think we thought he might have like potential fringe national team type caliber potential, and we haven't seen that yet. Behind him, it's Jason Palacios, who to be honest, I didn't even know who he was before Nashville signed him. They're pretty high on him. I mean, knowing them, I don't think they would have burned an international roster spot on a center back if they didn't think he could at least challenge for starting minutes. And then Josh Bauer, who has been playing right back a lot in preseason because of injuries. But I think he's probably the third guy on the depth chart. So I think that whoever partners Zimmerman will probably change a good bit early in the season while Callahan tries to figure out who his starter is. But they have depth there, and I don't think either of those three guys are net negatives in any way. And so I think if Zimmerman stays healthy, I think he's the type of guy who kind of elevates everybody around him. And so if you get 30 games from Zimmerman this year, I would wager that this defense is pretty solid.
And just to something you said, Goss, earlier about Nashville being known for that defensive stability as the team for defensive stability, I really think they're moving away from that in this Nashville SC 2.0. I think that, they're not going to just like not defend, but what we saw last year was a pretty rough go for the defensive core, and it did improve this year a little bit. Andy Nahar, Palacios maybe, but they didn't spend their resources there, and I think that tells you that this team is moving towards the midfield and the forward lines more so than the defensive line, which has been where they always reinforced every single preseason, right? So I think you're going to see a team that's a little bit more focused on pressing and having the ball rather than a team that's more sitting back and waiting for the opponent to do something.
I'm excited to see Walker Zimmerman in that setup because what, helped elevate him into the player that we just talked Jack Mayer potentially could be was playing at LAFC in an open game where he showed his ability to cover over the top, to close down space, to win a ton of 1v1 battles. And it's been a different role at times in Nashville. I think one he's also been really well suited to, of being sort of that dominant piece inside of a set block. But I think he still has that skill set. I think that's why Greg Berhalter kept calling him in and liked what he was able to bring when the team got pulled a little bit higher and was able to be more aggressive. His ability to defend 1v1 at that center back position. I'm going to go over on this as well. I agree with sort of what you both said about his injury concerns not being injury prone and constant. And even if the Gold Cup does happen, I think he'll still get over that number. I also think there's a difference for a team that's just out of it versus a team that's contending for a playoff spot, and you're the DP captain center back, and you want to be out there on the field and you can fight for it. You've got that relationship with PJ Callahan as well. So I have high expectations for the year he's going to have. And I think I have higher expectations than what Matt Doyle said about the season that's coming for Nashville. We're doing our watchability rankings coming up, myself and Tom. I think, Valera, as you talked about, they won't defend ever, a single time, so they'll be high on the list. We'll take the 10-9 games. And even if it's not that, I think they're going to be much more fun to watch than they've been the last few years. No matter what, the place to follow it, 615 Soccer and Pharmaceutical Soccer as well. Get involved, join. The coverage is fantastic. As I said, MLS coverage on top of just Nashville coverage. So if you like this league and you like following it and you want to do it as well as you can, it's a good resource for you. And hopefully we'll have you guys on at some point over the course of the year if things are going moderately well.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, David. Nice seeing you again. Next week, same time?
Absolutely. Put in the calendar.